In the winter of 1832, in a small frontier settlement along the muddy banks of the Missouri River, 3 children were born who would redefine everything the medical world thought it knew about human anatomy. These weren't ordinary infants. They possessed no skeletal structure whatsoever, no blood flowing through their veins, yet somehow they lived, they breathed, they moved, and according to the horrified witnesses present at their birth, they watched everything with an intelligence that no newborn should possess. What happened in that isolated cabin during the longest night of winter would set in motion a chain of events that medical journals still refuse to publish, that historians have buried in their archives, and that the few surviving descendants of those who witnessed it speak of only in whispers. This is the story of the Whitmore triplets and the darkness that followed their impossible existence into our world. The Missouri Territory in 1832 was a harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival depended on community, determination, and a healthy respect for the unknown forces that seemed to lurk in the endless wilderness. Towns were scattered like islands in an ocean of prairie grass and dense forest, connected only by rough wagon trails that became impassable quagmires with each spring thaw. St. Genevieve, situated along the western bank of the Mississippi River, was one such settlement. With a population of barely 300 souls, it served as a trading post and supply station for farmers, trappers, and the occasional missionary brave enough to venture into the untamed territories beyond. The town boasted a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and most unusually for a frontier settlement, a properly trained physician. Dr. Cornelius Hayes had arrived in Genevieve 3 years prior, carrying with him credentials from the University of Pennsylvania's Medical College, and a leather satchel filled with the most advanced surgical instruments money could buy. At 34 he was young for a frontier doctor, but his thick black beard and serious demeanor gave him an air of authority that the settlers found reassuring. More importantly, he had steady hands and a sharp mind, qualities that meant the difference between life and death in a place where the nearest hospital was 200 miles away. Hayes kept meticulous records of every case he treated, filling leather-bound journals with detailed observations, sketches, and theories. His cabin, which doubled as the town's only medical facility, was lined with these journals, a growing library of frontier medicine that he hoped would one day contribute to the advancement of medical science. He had no way of knowing that one particular entry, dated February 15, 1832, would never see the light of publication. The winter of 1831-1832 was particularly brutal. Snow began falling in early November and continued with only brief respites through February. The Missouri River froze solid enough to support loaded wagons, and food supplies ran dangerously low as hunting parties returned empty-handed day after day. It was during this harsh season that Thomas Whitmore arrived in Genevieve with his pregnant wife Clara seeking shelter and medical assistance. Thomas was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He claimed to be a traveling preacher from Kentucky, though his knowledge of scripture seemed limited and his manner of speech carried an accent that Dr. Hayes couldn't quite place. Clara, barely 19 and heavy with child, rarely spoke and never made eye contact with anyone in town. When she did venture out of their rented room above the general store, residents noted that she moved with an odd gliding gait, as if she were floating just above the ground. Hayes first examined Clara in early February, noting in his journal that her pregnancy appeared normal, though he observed some unusual characteristics. Her belly was remarkably cold to the touch, even through multiple layers of winter clothing. Her pulse, while regular, seemed unusually slow, perhaps 40 beats per minute compared to the normal 70 or 80 he would expect from a woman in her condition. Most peculiarly, when he attempted to listen for the baby's heartbeat using his wooden stethoscope, he heard nothing but a strange rhythmic humming sound, like the vibration of tuning forks deep underwater. Everything appears to be progressing normally, he assured Thomas, though privately he was troubled by his findings. Your wife should deliver within the next 2 weeks, provided there are no complications. Thomas Whitmore's response was unlike any Hayes had received from an expectant father. Instead of relief or joy, the man's face darkened with what could only be described as dread. Doctor, he said in his oddly accented voice, when the time comes, I must ask that you document everything you observe, everything, no matter how unusual it might appear. I always keep detailed records, Mr. Whitmore. It's standard medical practice. This will not be standard, Thomas replied cryptically. And doctor, when they are born, and there will be 3 of them, do not attempt to separate them. not even for examination. They must remain together. Dr. Hayes found this request bizarre. How could Thomas know there would be triplets? Even the most experienced physician couldn't make such a determination with certainty, and Dr. Hayes's examination had suggested only a single child. More disturbing was the implication that the children might somehow be physically connected, a condition known as conjoined twins, though he had never encountered a case involving 3 infants. Whitmore, if the children are conjoined, separation might be medically necessary to ensure their survival. I cannot make such promises without examining. They will not be conjoined, Thomas interrupted. They will be something else entirely. Promise me, Doc. Promise me you will not separate them, no matter what you see. Against his better judgment, Dr. Hayes agreed. There was something in Thomas Whitmore's desperate tone that suggested this was more than the nervous ramblings of an expectant father. As he would later write in his journal, I felt as though I was making a pact with forces beyond my understanding, though at the time I dismissed such thoughts as frontier superstition affecting my usually rational mind. The night of February 15th brought with it a blizzard, unlike any the residents of St. Genevieve had experienced. Wind howled through the town with such force that several cabin roofs were torn away, and the temperature plummeted to what one trapper later estimated was 40 degrees below zero. It was as if nature itself was recoiling from what was about to unfold. Dr. Hayes was awakened at approximately 2 in the morning by frantic pounding on his door. Through the howling wind he could hear Thomas Whitmore's voice calling for help. Grabbing his medical bag and wrapping himself in his heaviest coat, the doctor followed Thomas through the knee-deep snow to the general store, where Clara's labor had begun. The scene that greeted Dr. Hayes in the small room above the store defied everything he thought he knew about childbirth. Clara lay on the bed, her face serene despite the obvious intensity of her contractions. But it was her abdomen that captured the doctor's horrified attention. Rather than the normal movements of a child shifting position, Clara's belly rippled and flowed like water, as if whatever was inside possessed no solid form whatsoever. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, the town's midwife, stood in the corner of the room, her face pale with terror. "Dr. Hayes," she whispered as he approached the bed, "I've delivered over 200 babies in my time, but I've never seen anything like this. Feel for yourself." Dr. Hayes placed his hands on Clara's abdomen and immediately recoiled. The sensation was unlike anything in his medical experience. Instead of the firm resistance of a baby's body, his hands encountered something that yielded and shifted like thick liquid. More disturbing still, wherever he pressed, he could feel a response, not the random movements of a fetus, but what seemed like deliberate reactions to his touch. "How long has she been in labor?" he asked Miss Briggs, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the growing unease that gripped him. "Since midnight," the midwife replied. "But doctor, the contractions, they're not normal. They come in perfect intervals, exactly 3 minutes apart, and they've never varied by even a second. It's as if whatever's in there is controlling the process." Dr. Hayes checked his pocket watch and observed the contractions for the next quarter hour. Mrs. Briggs was correct. The timing was unnaturally precise, more like the mechanism of a clock than the irregular patterns of natural labor. Even more unsettling was Clara's demeanor. Despite the obvious intensity of each contraction, she never cried out, never showed signs of pain. Her eyes remained closed, and her breathing was steady and controlled, as if she were in some form of trance. As the night progressed, Hayes documented every detail in his journal, creating sketches of the unusual movements beneath Clara's skin, and noting the strange, sweet scent that seemed to emanate from her body, a smell he would later describe as honey mixed with copper, and something organic that I could not identify, but which reminded me of the forest floor after a heavy rain. At precisely 3:33 in the morning, Clara's eyes snapped open for the first time since Dr. Hayes had arrived. But these were not the eyes he remembered from his previous examination. Where before they had been an ordinary brown, they now appeared completely white, with no visible pupils or irises. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from deep within her chest. "They come now," she said in a tone that seemed to echo despite the small confines of the room. "The vessels are prepared. The Trinity is complete." Thomas Whitmore, who had been sitting silently in the corner throughout the labor, suddenly stood and began to chant in a language that Hayes had never heard. The words seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Clara's contractions, and the doctor noted that the mysterious movements beneath her skin became more agitated with each syllable. What happened next would haunt Dr. Hayes for the remainder of his life. The first child emerged, not through normal delivery, but by seeming to flow out of Clara's body like mercury poured from a vessel. Dr. Hayes found himself catching not a solid infant, but something with the consistency of thick liquid, that nonetheless maintained a roughly human shape. The child, if it could be called that, was pale as moonlight, and translucent enough that Dr. Hayes could see shadows moving within its form. "My God," he whispered, nearly dropping the impossible infant. What is this?" The child had no bones. Hayes could feel this immediately as he attempted to support its head and neck. Instead of the rigid structure of a normal infant's skeleton, his hands encountered only soft, yielding tissue that bent and flexed in ways that should have been impossible. When he tried to locate a pulse on the child's wrist, he found no heartbeat, no blood vessels beneath the translucent skin. Yet the child was undeniably alive. Its chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and its limbs moved with purposeful, coordinated motion. But most disturbing of all were its eyes. Like its mother's, they were completely white, but they tracked Dr. Hayes's movements with an intelligence that no newborn should possess. When the doctor tried to examine its mouth, the child opened its lips to reveal not the toothless gums of a normal infant, but rows of small, perfectly formed teeth that gleamed like polished pearl in the lamplight. Before Hayes could fully process what he was holding, the second child began to emerge, flowing from Clara's body with the same liquid grace as the first. This infant was identical to its sibling in every detail, boneless, bloodless, translucent, and possessed of that same unsettling intelligence. Mrs. Briggs, who had been standing frozen in shock, finally found her voice. "Dear Lord in heaven," she gasped. "They ain't natural. They ain't human." The third child followed moments later, completing what Thomas Whitmore had predicted would be a trinity. As Dr. Hayes held all three infants, he noticed that they seemed to pulse in unison, their translucent forms brightening and dimming, in perfect synchronization, as if they shared some invisible connection that bound them together at a level beyond the physical. Clara, despite having just delivered 3 children, showed no signs of exhaustion or trauma. Her breathing remained steady, her color good, and when Dr. Hayes examined her, he found that her body had already begun to return to its pre-pregnancy state, with impossible speed. Most unnaturally, there was no blood, no afterbirth, no physical evidence that a delivery had taken place beyond the 3 impossible children that now lay beside her on the bed. "What are they?" Dr. Hayes asked Thomas, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the name of all that's holy, what have you brought into this world?" Thomas Whitmore's storm-grey eyes met the doctor's gaze, and in them Dr. Hayes saw not the joy of a new father, but something that might have been profound sadness, mixed with terrible purpose. "They are the beginning," Thomas replied, "the first of their kind in this world, but not the last. Doctor, you have witnessed something that will not be recorded in any medical journal, something that challenges every assumption about the nature of life itself. These children are vessels, containers for something far older and more powerful than human understanding can encompass." "Vessels for what?" Dr. Hayes demanded, though part of him feared the answer. "For knowledge," Thomas said cryptically, "for memories that predate human civilization, for purposes that will not become clear for many years to come." As if responding to their father's words, the 3 infants turned their white pupilless eyes toward Dr. Hayes in perfect unison, and in that moment, the doctor experienced something that would plague his dreams for decades to come. The absolute certainty that these 3 impossible children were studying him, with an intelligence that was ancient, alien, and utterly inhuman. Word of the unusual birth spread through Genevieve with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. Within days, despite Dr. Hayes's attempts at maintaining medical confidentiality, every resident knew that something extraordinary and deeply unsettling had occurred in the room above the general store. Miss Briggs, traumatized by what she had witnessed, found herself unable to keep silent about the boneless, bloodless children who moved like liquid and watched with ancient eyes. The initial reaction was a mixture of morbid curiosity and growing unease. Several townspeople attempted to visit the Whitmore family, bringing food and baby clothes, as was customary for new parents. However, Thomas turned away all visitors, claiming that Clara needed rest and the children were too fragile for social calls. Those who caught glimpses of the infants through the window reported seeing shapes that moved wrong, and eyes that followed you even when they should have been sleeping. Dr. Hayes found himself in an increasingly difficult position. As the town's only physician, residents looked to him for scientific explanations for the impossible children, Yet how could he explain what defied every principle of anatomy and physiology he had learned? In his private journal, he wrote, "I have examined these infants multiple times over the past week, and each observation only deepens the mystery. They require no nourishment. Clara attempts to nurse them, but they show no interest in feeding. They never cry, never sleep in any recognizable pattern, and their movements become more coordinated with each passing day. Most disturbing is their apparent communication with one another. Though they make no sounds, they respond to each other's movements with perfect synchronization, as if they share a collective consciousness." The doctor's attempts to understand the children's physiology proved equally baffling. When he pressed a stethoscope to their chests, he heard not heartbeats but a low, harmonic humming that seemed to emanate from their entire bodies. Their skin, while appearing translucent, was surprisingly resilient. Needles bent rather than penetrating when he attempted to draw blood samples. Most puzzling of all, the children seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In direct sunlight, they appeared almost luminous, while in shadows they became nearly invisible. As February gave way to March, the children began to display abilities that pushed the boundaries of Dr. Hayes's sanity. They moved in perfect unison, even when placed in separate rooms, turned their heads to track people who hadn't yet entered their line of sight, and seemed to respond to conversations held in whispers from other parts of the building. Miss Patterson, who ran the general store, reported that items on her shelves would rearrange themselves overnight when the family was staying above. "It's like they're reaching out with invisible hands," she told Dr. Hayes during one of his visits. "Books reorganize themselves, jars move to different shelves, and I swear I've seen shadows moving when there's nothing there to cast them." The doctor initially dismissed such reports as the products of overwrought imaginations, but he soon witnessed similar phenomena himself. During one examination, he placed his pocket watch on a table across the room. Without any physical contact, the watch began to slide across the wooden surface, coming to rest directly beside the infant he was examining. When he moved the watch back to its original position, the same thing happened again. More disturbing were the changes occurring in Clara Whitmore herself. Far from recovering from childbirth, she seemed to be transforming in subtle but undeniable ways. Her movements became increasingly fluid, matching the liquid grace of her children. Her eyes, which had returned to their normal brown color after the birth, now occasionally flashed white when she thought no one was watching. Most unsettling was her apparent loss of human needs. Dr. Hayes never observed her eating, drinking or sleeping, yet she showed no signs of fatigue or malnutrition. Thomas, meanwhile, had begun to exhibit signs of severe psychological strain. The man who had arrived in Genevieve as a composed, if mysterious preacher, now appeared haggard and fearful. He jumped at sudden sounds, mumbled to himself in that unknown language Dr. Hayes had heard during the birth, and seemed to age years within. When questioned about his family's unusual circumstances, his responses became increasingly incoherent. "They're not what I expected," he confided to Dr. Hayes during one late-night encounter. "The process was supposed to be gradual, but they're developing too quickly, learning too fast. I fear I may have miscalculated the timing." "Timing for what?" Dr. Hayes pressed. "Thomas, you must tell me what's happening to your family. As a physician, I need to understand." "Understanding is not within your reach, doctor," Thomas interrupted, his storm-gray eyes now showing distinct signs of madness. "What I have brought into this world predates human understanding by millennia. These children are not learning to be human, they're remembering how to be something else entirely." The breaking point came on March 10th, when young Billy Morrison, the blacksmith's 8-year-old son, went missing. The boy had been playing near the general store when he simply vanished, leaving behind only his wooden toy horse and a small pile of his clothes. A search party scoured the town and surrounding area for 3 days without finding any trace of the child. On the third night of the search, Miss Morrison reported seeing something pale and flowing outside her bedroom window, moving in the direction of the general store. When she looked more carefully, she claimed to see 3 identical figures that moved like water running uphill, along the building's wall. By morning, Billy Morrison was found sleeping peacefully in his own bed, with no memory of the previous 3 days, and no explanation for his disappearance. But Billy had changed. Where before he had been a normal, energetic child, he now moved with the same fluid grace that characterized the Whitmore family. His speech patterns altered, becoming more formal, and using words that no 8-year-old should know. Most disturbing of all, his eyes would occasionally flash white, and he began to demonstrate knowledge of events that had occurred in town long before his birth. Dr. Hayes examined the boy and found physical changes that defied medical explanation. Billy's pulse had slowed to match the rhythm he'd observed in Clara and her children. His body temperature was several degrees below normal, yet he showed no signs of hypothermia. When Dr. Hayes tested the boy's reflexes, he found responses that were too quick, too coordinated, as if Billy's nervous system had been somehow enhanced or replaced. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Children would disappear for brief periods, always returning with no memory of their absence, but displaying the same physical and behavioral changes as Billy Morrison. Parents began to notice their children speaking in unison without planning, moving in synchronized patterns, and demonstrating knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. The town's fear reached a crescendo when Reverend Marcus Stone, St. Genevieve's elderly preacher, approached Dr. Hayes with a discovery that chilled both men to the bone. While researching historical records in the church archives, Reverend Stone had uncovered reports of similar events dating back over a century: traveling families with impossible children, mysterious disappearances, and gradual changes in local children that always followed the same pattern. "Doctor," the Reverend said, his weathered hands trembling as he opened an ancient leather-bound journal, "I've found records from settlements across the frontier territories: Wisconsin, in 1798, Ohio, in 1760. Always the same story. A mysterious family arrives in winter, children are born who defy natural law, and within months the entire community has changed." The journal contained detailed accounts from witnesses, many of them physicians and clergy like themselves. The descriptions were hauntingly familiar: boneless children who moved like liquid, parents who seemed to lose their humanity gradually, and local children who began to display impossible abilities and knowledge. What happened to those settlements? Dr. Hayes asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Reverend Stone turned to the final entry in each account. "They disappeared, Doctor. Entire communities vanished without a trace. The only evidence of their existence is these records, hidden away in church archives and medical journals that were never published. It's as if something is systematically erasing them from history." As the implications of the Reverend's discovery sank in, Dr. Hayes realized that Genevieve was following the same pattern. The town's children were changing, becoming something other than human. Their parents, initially concerned, were gradually accepting these transformations as normal. Even Hayes himself had begun to feel a strange pull toward the Whitmore family, an urge to visit them more frequently and to accept their impossible nature as simply another medical curiosity. "We have to warn the town," Hayes said, but even as he spoke the words, he felt a peculiar reluctance to follow through on the idea. It was as if some external force was dampening his urgency, making the situation seem less dire than his rational mind knew it to be. "I tried to speak with the congregation last Sunday," Reverend Stone admitted, "but when I stood at the pulpit, the words wouldn't come. It was as if something was preventing me from raising the alarm. Doctor, I fear we may already be too late. Whatever influence these children possess, it's already beginning to affect us all." The breakthrough in understanding came from an unexpected source. Professor Jonathan Blackwood, a traveling anthropologist from Harvard University, arrived in Genevieve in late March, drawn by reports of unusual medical phenomena that had reached academic circles in the East. Unlike the town's residents, who had been gradually influenced by the children's presence, Blackwood arrived with a mind still capable of objective observation and analysis. Dr. Hayes first met Professor Blackwood at the town's small inn, where the academic was staying while conducting his research. Blackwood was a thin, intense man in his 50s, with prematurely white hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings. He carried with him several worn leather satchels filled with ancient texts, ethnographic notes and artifacts from indigenous cultures across North America. Dr. Hayes, Blackwood said during their initial meeting, "I've traveled here because your case has attracted attention in circles that study anomalous phenomena. What you've described in your correspondence to medical colleagues sounds remarkably similar to accounts I've encountered in various tribal traditions." Dr. Hayes was puzzled. "I haven't written to any colleagues about the Whitmore children. I've documented everything in my personal journals, but I haven't shared those observations with anyone outside St. Genevieve." Professor Blackwood's expression grew grave. "That's interesting, Doctor, because somehow your observations have been circulating in academic circles for weeks." Someone or something wants this information to spread, but only to specific individuals. I've found similar patterns in historical cases. Knowledge is shared selectively, almost as if the entities involved are recruiting researchers and scholars for their own purposes. The professor opened one of his satchels and removed a collection of documents that made Dr. Hayes's blood run cold. Newspaper clippings, medical reports and personal testimonies from across the continent, all describing events virtually identical to what was occurring in St. Genevieve. The dates spanned decades, and each account followed the same pattern: mysterious families, impossible children, gradual transformation of local communities, and eventual disappearance. Professor Dr. Hayes said, studying the documents, these reports suggest that this phenomenon has been occurring for centuries. But how is that possible? The families I've read about here would have to be immortal, Blackwood finished, or at least extremely long-lived. Doctor, I believe we're dealing with entities that exist outside normal human lifespans and biological constraints. The children you've observed may not be children in any conventional sense, but rather ancient beings taking human form for purposes we don't yet understand. Blackwood's research had led him to tribal legends from across North America, many of which spoke of the Hollow Ones, beings that appeared human but possessed no souls, no connection to the natural world that bound all living things. According to these legends, the Hollow Ones could take any form but preferred to appear as children, using human innocence and parental instincts to infiltrate communities. The Cherokee have a term for them, Blackwood explained, consulting his notes. Nunahi, Eve's spirit children, who steal the essence of human young, replacing their souls with something ancient and alien. The legends say they appear during times of transition, when communities are isolated and vulnerable. The professor had also discovered disturbing parallels in European folklore. Medieval accounts spoke of changeling broods, groups of supernatural children who would replace human infants and gradually transform entire villages. These accounts were often dismissed as superstition, but Blackwood had found consistent patterns that suggested a basis in reality. What do they want? Dr. Hayes asked, though he suspected the answer would be deeply unsettling. Preservation, Blackwood replied. According to every legend I've studied, these entities are the remnants of a pre-human civilization that was destroyed by some great catastrophe. They survive by inhabiting human communities, slowly converting the population to serve as vessels for their consciousness and knowledge. They're not invading our world, they're reclaiming it. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's theories were correct, the Whitmore triplets weren't human children at all, but ancient entities using human form to systematically replace the population of Genevieve with beings loyal to their cause. The gradual changes in the town's children weren't supernatural infections, but a deliberate recruitment process. We need to examine the children directly, Blackwood said. I've brought instruments that might be able to detect energies or properties that conventional medical equipment cannot measure. Dr. Hayes arranged for them to visit the Whitmore family under the pretense of a routine medical consultation. Thomas, now appearing even more haggard and fearful than before, reluctantly allowed them to examine the children, though he insisted on remaining present throughout the evaluation. What Professor Blackwood's instruments revealed defied everything Dr. Hayes thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. The electromagnetic field detector that Blackwood had borrowed from the university's physics department registered massive energy fluctuations around each child, readings that suggested they were generating or channeling power sources far beyond normal biological process. A specialized thermometer designed to measure radiant heat showed that the children's bodies were actually absorbing thermal energy from their surroundings rather than generating it, creating localized cold spots in the room. Most disturbing were the results from Blackwood's photographic equipment. When he attempted to take photographs of the children using a new daguerreotype process, the images showed not three infants but swirling patterns of light and shadow that seemed to move independently on the photographic plates. In several images, the patterns formed symbols that matched hieroglyphs Blackwood had documented in pre-Columbian ruins across the Americas. Thomas, Dr. Hayes said, confronting the children's father after the examination, Professor Blackwood's research suggests that your children are not human. We've found evidence that entities matching their description have been appearing for centuries, always with the same purpose. You need to tell us the truth about what you've brought to our town. Thomas Whitmore's composure finally cracked. Tears streaming down his gaunt face, he collapsed into a chair and began to speak in a voice hollow with despair. I never intended for it to happen this way, he whispered. I was contacted by them in dreams, visions that seemed more real than waking life. They showed me knowledge beyond human understanding, the true history of this world, the civilizations that existed before the flood, the technology and wisdom that was lost when their kind was driven into hiding. Thomas explained that he had been chosen as a vessel bearer, a human selected to provide the physical means for the ancient entities to return to corporeal form. Clara had been specially prepared through rituals that gradually transformed her biology, making her capable of bearing children that were not entirely human. They promised me immortality, Thomas continued, knowledge of the ancients, a place in the new world they would create. But they deceived me about the nature of the process. I thought I would retain my humanity, my free will. Instead, I feel myself fading day by day, becoming nothing more than a puppet for their purposes. Professor Blackwood listened with grim fascination as Thomas revealed details of the entity's plans. St. Genevieve was just one of many communities being systematically converted across the frontier territory. The isolated nature of frontier settlements made them ideal targets. Small populations that could be transformed without attracting attention from larger governmental or military authorities. How many communities have they taken? Dr. Hayes asked. Dozens, Thomas replied. And when each community is fully converted, its population spreads outward to establish new settlements, new recruitment centers. They're patient, willing to work over decades or centuries to achieve their goal. By the time anyone in authority realizes what's happening, entire regions will be under their control. The conversation was interrupted by Clara entering the room, moving with that fluid, unnatural grace that had become her hallmark. But now Hayes could see her transformation was accelerating. Her skin had taken on the same translucent quality as her children, and her eyes flickered between brown and white with increasing frequency. Thomas speaks of plans and purposes, she said, her voice carrying those strange harmonics that seemed to resonate from within her chest. But he understands so little of what he has become part of. Dr. Hayes, Professor Blackwood, you have seen our children, witnessed their capabilities. Do you not understand the gift we offer? Gift, Dr. Hayes replied, his voice tight with anger and fear. You're stealing the souls of our children, replacing them with something alien and wrong. Clara's laugh was like music played through water. Souls? Doctor, your medical training has made you so literal. We do not steal souls. We elevate them. The children of your settlement are being prepared for transcendence, freed from the limitations of human mortality and ignorance. In time, they will possess knowledge and abilities that will make your current understanding of reality seem infantile. Professor Blackwood stepped forward, his academic curiosity overriding his fear. What happened to your original civilization? Why do you need human hosts instead of existing in your natural forms? Clara's expression grew distant, almost melancholy. We were the first children of this world, born when the continents were young and the ice stretched from sea to sea. Our civilization reached heights that your kind cannot imagine. We shaped matter with thought, traveled between worlds through pure consciousness, and understood the fundamental forces that bind reality together. She paused, her white eyes reflecting memories of unimaginable age. But we grew proud, challenged forces that should have remained undisturbed. The result was catastrophe. Our physical forms were destroyed, our cities buried beneath ice and stone, our people scattered into the spaces between dimensions. Only a few of us retained enough coherence to survive, and only by binding ourselves to the life force of younger species. And now you're using humanity as your new physical forms, Dr. Hayes concluded. We are offering humanity evolution, Clara corrected, partnership with beings of vastly superior knowledge and capability. Your children will retain their essential selves, but enhanced beyond anything their purely human heritage could provide. They will live for centuries, possess abilities you would consider miraculous, and help guide your species to achievements that would otherwise be impossible. Professor Blackwood was taking notes frantically, recognizing that he was documenting contact with intelligences of potentially immense historical significance. But Dr. Hayes felt only growing horror at the implications of Clara's words. What about those who refuse your gift? He asked. What happens to humans who want to remain human? Clara's smile was beautiful and terrible. They will be preserved, Doctor. maintained in comfort and safety as beloved ancestors of the new hybrid race. Some will be selected for breeding programs to ensure genetic diversity. Others will serve as repositories of human culture and knowledge. None will be harmed. We are not destroyers but gardeners, tending the growth of something greater than either of our species could achieve alone. The room fell silent as the full scope of the entity's plans became clear. They weren't simply invading or conquering. They were orchestrating the systematic replacement of humanity with a hybrid species under their control, and they were doing it gradually, community by community, using humanity's own protective instincts toward children as the vector for their infiltration. Professor Blackwood was the first to speak. How long do we have before the process in St. Genevieve is complete? Clara tilted her head, consulting some internal chronometer beyond human perception. The children have adapted more quickly than anticipated. Full integration should be complete within days rather than weeks. Already, more than half of your community's young have begun the transition. Soon their parents will follow, drawn by bonds of love and protection that we have learned to exploit so effectively. Thomas Whitmore looked up from his chair, his face a mask of despair and madness. You see, Doctor, we are already. I brought this upon our town, and there is no way to stop what I have set in motion. The only choice now is whether to resist futilely or accept what we are becoming. But Dr. Hayes was not ready to surrender. As a man of science and medicine, he had devoted his life to fighting against forces that threatened human health and survival. If there was any possibility of reversing or preventing what was happening to St. Genevieve, he was determined to find it. Professor, he said, turning to Blackwood, your research into these entities, have you found any accounts of communities that successfully resisted them? Blackwood consulted his notes, his expression growing more hopeful. Actually, several tribal legends speak of shamans and medicine men who were able to drive out the Hollow Ones using specific rituals and preparations. And there's a fascinating account from a Jesuit mission in Quebec that describes a successful defense against what they called demon children. Clara's expression darkened as she listened to their conversation. You speak of primitive superstitions and religious hysteria. The few times our kind has been forced to withdraw, it was due to random factors, not human intervention. You cannot fight forces you do not understand with weapons drawn from ignorance. Perhaps, Dr. Hayes replied, but we have advantages that those historical communities lacked. We have scientific instruments, detailed documentation, and most importantly advance warning of your intention. Professor Blackwood, what did those successful resistance efforts have in common? Blackwood flipped through his notes eagerly. Interestingly, they all involved disrupting the entity's connection to the children they had influenced. The shamanic rituals focused on severing the invisible threads that bound the Hollow Ones to their human hosts. The Jesuit account mentions using blessed silver implements to break what they called unholy bonds. As the two men discussed potential countermeasures, none of them noticed that the three Whitmore children had entered the room, moving with their characteristic liquid grace. The infants arranged themselves in a triangle formation around the adults, their white eyes fixed on Dr. Hayes and Professor Blackwood with unmistakable intent. You will not interfere with our integration, they spoke in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in the listeners' minds. You have learned too much, and must be brought into compliance, or removed, as obstacles. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an oppressive presence that pressed against their minds, like a physical weight. Dr. Hayes felt his thoughts becoming sluggish, his determination wavering, as an alien intelligence probed at the edges of his consciousness. But Professor Blackwood, perhaps protected by his years of studying such phenomena, retained enough clarity to act. Reaching into his satchel, he pulled out a small silver cross and a vial of what appeared to be ordinary water. Holy water blessed by a Lakota medicine man, he explained quickly, and silver consecrated in rituals from 5 different tribal traditions. If the historical accounts are accurate, these should disrupt their influence. As Blackwood began to sprinkle the water in a circle around them, the effect on the children was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled as if burned, their perfect unison broken for the first time, as each reacted differently to the assault on their supernatural connection. It's working, Dr. Hayes gasped, feeling the pressure on his mind lifting. Professor, we need to get this information to the town. If we can break their hold on the other children, His words were cut off as Clara let out a scream that seemed to come from every direction at once. Her translucent form began to shift and blur, revealing glimpses of something vast and alien that merely wore human appearance as a disguise. "You have made a grave error," she hissed, her voice now carrying undertones that hurt to hear. "We offered partnership. Now we will take what we require through force." The confrontation in the Whitmore's room marked the beginning of a supernatural siege that would test every resident of Genevieve's courage and humanity. As Clara's scream echoed through the building, windows throughout the town began to shatter simultaneously, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that water in wells and rain barrels froze solid within minutes. Dr. Hayes and Professor Blackwood fought their way out of the general store as the building itself seemed to come alive around them. Walls bulged and contracted like breathing flesh, floorboards bent and twisted into impossible angles, and shadows moved independently of any light source. Behind them, they could hear the Whitmore children speaking in that ancient language, their voices harmonizing in patterns that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. "The church," Blackwood shouted over the supernatural cacophony. "We need to reach Reverend Stone and gather the townspeople in consecrated ground." They ran through streets that had become a nightmare landscape. The very air seemed thick and hostile, pressing against them with almost physical resistance. Street lamps flickered and died, leaving only an unnatural phosphorescent glow that emanated from the general store and cast writhing shadows that moved against the direction of any earthly light source. Other residents had emerged from their homes, drawn by the otherworldly sounds and the sudden, inexplicable cold. But Hayes was horrified to see that many of them, particularly the parents of children who had been changed, stood motionless in their doorways, their eyes reflecting that familiar white glow as they watched the chaos with inhuman calm. Miss Patterson, the store owner, stepped into their path as they approached the church. Her movements had the same fluid quality that characterized the Whitmore family, and when she spoke, her voice carried those unsettling harmonics. "Dr. Hayes, Professor Blackwood," she said, her tone reasonable despite the apocalyptic scene unfolding around them. "Why do you resist what is inevitable? Your children are becoming something greater than human. Soon you too will understand the gift we offer." "Martha," Dr. Hayes replied, recognizing the woman he had known for 3 years. "Fight whatever influence they have over you. You're still human underneath whatever they've done. You can break free." Mrs. Patterson's laugh was like Clara's, musical and terrible. "Doctor, I am more free now than I have ever been. Free from the limitations of mortal existence. Free from the ignorance that constrains human understanding. My daughter Emma has shown me wonders beyond imagination. Would you deny her this transcendence?" Before Hayes could respond, young Emma Patterson emerged from the general store, her 8-year-old form moving with that characteristic liquid grace. But now the transformation was more advanced. Her skin had become translucent enough to reveal swirling patterns of light beneath, and her eyes were completely white, pupilless orbs that seemed to hold depths of ancient knowledge. "Hello, Dr. Hayes," Emma said in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "You helped bring my new brothers into this world. Will you not help us bring our entire community into the light of true understanding?" Professor Blackwood stepped protectively in front of Hayes, his silver cross held high and his remaining holy water ready. "These aren't your neighbors anymore, Doctor. Whatever these entities are, they're using human love and familial bonds as weapons against us." As if summoned by Emma's presence, other children began to emerge from houses throughout the town. Billy Morrison, the blacksmith's son, led a group of 5 youngsters, all moving in perfect synchronization, their white eyes fixed on the 2 men with predatory focus. From side streets came more children, some as young as toddlers, others approaching their teens, but all displaying the same inhuman coordination and ancient intelligence. "We tried to make this transition gentle," they spoke in unison, their combined voices creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the street. "But you force us to accelerate the process. Very well, let us show you the true extent of our capability." The children raised their hands in perfect coordination, and the town of St. Genevieve began to transform around them. Buildings stretched and warped, their wooden walls flowing like water to create new configurations that hurt to look at. The church, their destination, began to sink into the ground, as if the earth beneath it had turned to quicksand. "The consecrated ground," Blackwood gasped. "They're eliminating anything that might provide sanctuary." But Reverend Stone was not defenseless. As the church began to sink, the elderly preacher appeared at its entrance. carrying an enormous leather-bound Bible and a silver chalice that gleamed with an inner light. His voice rose above the supernatural chaos as he began to recite verses in Latin, his words seeming to push back against the otherworldly influences, transforming his town. Dr. Hayes, Professor Blackwood, the Reverend called to them, the sanctified items. They have power against these entities, but we need more people. We need the parents who haven't been fully converted yet. Dr. Hayes looked around at the townspeople who had emerged from their homes. He could see the confusion and terror in many faces. People who were fighting against the supernatural influence, but losing ground with each passing moment. Sheriff Hollister stood frozen outside the jail, his face contorted with internal struggle, as he fought against whatever force was trying to take control of his mind. The blacksmith, Jonas Morrison, clutched his head in agony as he watched his transformed son, leading the group of changed children. Jonas, Dr. Hayes called to the blacksmith, your son, whatever he's become, the real Billy is still in there somewhere. Professor Blackwood's research suggests these entities can be driven out. Morrison looked up with desperate hope. How, Doctor? How do we save our children? Professor Blackwood consulted his notes even as chaos swirled around them. The tribal accounts speak of severing the connection between the entities and their hosts. It requires something pure. Silver blessed in sacred rituals, water consecrated by those who truly understand the spiritual forces involved. I have both, Reverend Stone called from the sinking church, but they must be applied directly to each child, and the connection must be broken while they're separated from the primary entities. The Whitmore triplets. Dr. Hayes realized what needed to be done. We have to split up. Some of us need to get to the general store and contain or neutralize the original 3 children. The others need to work on freeing the local children, while they're separated from their source of power. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was their only hope. Sheriff Hollister, shaking off the supernatural influence through sheer force of will, joined their impromptu resistance. Several other adults, particularly parents of affected children, fought against the growing mental pressure to help their community. As they prepared to implement their plan, the transformed children of St. Genevieve began to advance on their position with coordinated precision. But these were no longer the innocent youngsters the adults had known and loved. They moved like predators, their white eyes fixed on their targets with inhuman calculation. Remember, Professor Blackwood warned as he distributed his remaining sanctified items. These entities are using the children's bodies as vessels. Be firm but careful. We're trying to free them, not harm them. The battle for Genevieve began in earnest as the adults charged toward the advancing children. Holy water and blessed silver their only weapons against forces that predated human civilization. The children's response was immediate and terrifying. They began to emit that harmonic humming sound in unison, creating vibrations that seemed to attack the very foundations of reality around them. Hayes, clutching a silver cross that Professor Blackwood had prepared with tribal blessings, approached Billy Morrison with desperate determination. Billy, he called to the boy he had helped deliver 8 years earlier. I know you're in there. Fight against whatever is controlling you. The child that had been Billy turned its white gaze toward the doctor, and for a moment, Dr. Hayes thought he saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of the human boy trapped within the alien presence. Dr. Hayes. The voice was Billy's, weak and confused, struggling against the harmonic undertones that tried to drown it out. I can't control my body. Something else is moving me, making me do things. Help me. Dr. Hayes lunged forward with the silver cross, pressing it against the boy's forehead. The effect was immediate and violent. Billy screamed with his own voice as brilliant light erupted from the point of contact. The alien harmonics faltered, and for a moment, the boy's eyes flickered from white back to their natural blue. But the victory was short-lived. From the general store came an answering scream of rage and power, as the Whitmore triplets responded to the attack on their network. Every transformed child in the town suddenly moved with renewed coordination, and the buildings around them began to shift and flow more rapidly, creating a maze-like environment that separated the defending adults from each other. Sheriff Hollister found himself cornered by 3 changed children, including his own nephew, Tom. He pleaded with his sister's boy. You know me, you know I would never hurt you. Please, fight against whatever has hold of. But young Tom Hollister spoke with the voice of vast, ancient intelligence. Uncle Robert, you cling to obsolete notions of individual identity. We are all one now, part of something greater than the sum of our parts. Join us willingly, and the transition will be painless. As the sheriff raised his blessed silver implement, preparing to attempt the same technique Dr. Hayes had used. The boy's form began to blur and shift, revealing glimpses of the alien intelligence wearing human appearance like an ill-fitting mask. Meanwhile, Reverend Stone had managed to reach the group of townspeople who were still fighting against the supernatural influence. Using his sanctified chalice and the power of his faith, he created a circle of protection around them, but he could feel the strain of maintaining it against forces that seemed to draw power from dimensions beyond human understanding. "We need to reach the source," he called to Dr. Hayes. "These children are just extensions of the primary entities. Until we deal with the Whitmore triplets, we'll be fighting symptoms instead of the disease itself." But reaching the general store had become nearly impossible. The building had transformed into something that violated every principle of architecture and physics. Its walls twisted upward into spirals that disappeared into darkness. Its windows multiplied and shifted position constantly, and its entrance had become a portal that seemed to lead into depths that couldn't possibly exist within the structure's original dimensions. Professor Blackwood, using his knowledge of historical accounts, began to understand what they were witnessing. "It's not just a building anymore," he shouted to the others. "They're using it as an anchor point between dimensions. The store has become a gateway to wherever these entities originally came from." As if responding to his words, shapes began to emerge from the transformed building. Not the fluid forms of the children, but something far more alien. Tall, angular beings that seemed to be constructed from shadow and starlight, moving with geometries that hurt to observe directly. These were the entity's true forms, no longer hiding behind human appearance. The temperature dropped even further, and the aurora borealis began to dance across the sky. Despite being hundreds of miles south of its normal range, the very air began to shimmer with otherworldly energies. As the barrier between dimensions grew thinner, "They're opening a permanent gateway," Professor Blackwood realized with growing horror. "Not just to transform this community, but to bring through their entire civilization. St. Genevieve is going to become a beachhead for a full-scale invasion of our reality." Dr. Hayes, still struggling to maintain the partial liberation of Billy Morrison, felt despair washing over him. They had underestimated the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about saving one frontier town, it was about preventing the subjugation of the entire human race. But as the situation seemed most hopeless, help arrived from an unexpected source. A group of riders thundered into the town, led by a figure that Dr. Hayes recognized with shock and amazement. It was Samuel Thornton, the physician he had corresponded with years earlier about unusual medical cases. But Thornton looked exactly as he had decades ago, apparently untouched by the passage of time. "Dr. Hayes," Thornton called as he dismounted, carrying saddlebags filled with items that glowed with the same inner light as Reverend Stone's sanctified implements. "We received Professor Blackwood's message. You're not facing this alone." Behind Thornton came a diverse group that Dr. Hayes would never have imagined working together. Native American shamans carrying sacred items that hummed with power. Jesuit priests, armed with relics and blessed weapons, and what appeared to be scholars and scientists from various institutions, all carrying equipment designed to combat supernatural threats. "Who are you people?" Dr. Hayes asked in amazement. "We are the Watchers," Dr. Thornton replied grimly. "A network of individuals from various backgrounds who have encountered these entities before and dedicated our lives to preventing their return. We've been tracking their activities across the continent for decades, always arriving too late to prevent the initial infiltration, but sometimes in time to prevent the final transformation." As the Watchers deployed their arsenal of sanctified weapons and scientifically enhanced spiritual tools, the true battle for St. Genevieve and potentially for humanity itself was about to begin in earnest. The arrival of the Watchers transformed the desperate struggle in St. Genevieve from a losing battle into a coordinated assault against forces that threatened the very nature of human existence. Dr. Thornton, moving with the efficiency of someone who had fought this battle many times before, immediately began organizing the defense, while his companions deployed their specialized equipment throughout the town. "Hayes," Thornton called as he unpacked devices that combined scientific precision with spiritual power. "We have perhaps an hour before the dimensional gateway stabilizes enough for their full civilization to cross over. After that point, no earthly force will be able to stop them." The Native American shamans, led by an elderly Lakota medicine man named Joseph Running Bear, began to create a spiritual barrier, around the transformed general store using a combination of sacred herbs, blessed stones and chanted prayers in languages that predated European colonization. The smoke from their ritual fires seemed to push back against the otherworldly energies emanating from the building, creating a buffer zone where human consciousness could function without supernatural interference. Meanwhile, the Jesuit priests, armed with relics that included fragments of the true cross and water from the River Jordan, worked to free the transformed children one by one. Their approach was more aggressive than Professor Blackwood's experimental methods, using centuries of church knowledge about combating demonic influences. Father Miguel Santos, the leader of the Jesuit contingent, explained their strategy to Dr. Hayes. As they advanced on a group of changed children, these entities exploit the bonds of love and protection between parents and children, but that same love, properly channeled through divine grace, can sever their connection to our reality. The process was harrowing to witness. Each child had to be restrained while the priests applied their sanctified implements directly to the points where the alien influence was strongest, usually the forehead and heart. The children screamed with voices that were both human and utterly inhuman, as two different forms of consciousness fought for control of the same body. Billy Morrison was among the first to be successfully freed. As Father Santos pressed a silver crucifix to the boy's chest while Reverend Stone recited specific passages from Scripture, the alien harmonics that had characterized Billy's speech suddenly stopped. The boy collapsed, his eyes returning to their natural blue color, and when he looked up at Hayes, it was with recognition and relief. "Doctor," Billy whispered, his voice weak but purely human. "I could see everything they were making me do, but I couldn't stop it. There were other voices in my head, telling me about places that existed before people, before anything we know." Hayes embraced the boy, feeling both relief and determination. If Billy could be freed, then the other children could be saved as well. But the process was dangerous. Several parents had to be restrained to prevent them from interfering with the exorcism procedures. Their transformed minds, unable to distinguish between healing and harm. While the priests and townspeople worked to free the local children, Thornton led a specialized team toward the transformed general store. This group included Professor Blackwood, whose research had provided crucial insights into the entity's weaknesses, and several watchers who carried weapons specifically designed to combat interdimensional threats. The building had continued to evolve since their earlier encounter, its architecture now resembling something from a fever dream, rather than anything constructed by human hands. Walls curved impossibly upward, doors opened onto rooms that couldn't exist within the original structure's dimensions, and windows showed views of alien landscapes under foreign stars. "The transformation is accelerating," Thornton observed, checking instruments that measured dimensional stability. "They're using the building as an anchor point to merge our reality with theirs. If we don't stop this process soon, the entire region could be pulled into their dimensional space." As they approached the building's entrance, which now appeared as a swirling vortex of shadow and light, they could hear the Whitmore triplets chanting in that ancient language, their voices harmonizing with sounds that seemed to come from the very foundations of reality. The temperature around the building had dropped so low that their breath formed ice crystals, and the aurora borealis overhead had intensified to the point where it provided more illumination than the sun. "The children are at the center of it all," Professor Blackwood said, consulting his instruments. "They're serving as conduits for energies from their original dimension. If we can disrupt their connection, it won't be as simple as the local children," Dr. Thornton warned. "These three are the primary anchors. They're not possessed by the entities. They are the entities, using human form as a bridge between dimensions. Separating them from their power source will require destroying the physical vessels they've created." The implications were clear and horrible. To save St. Genevieve and prevent a full-scale dimensional invasion, they would have to kill what appeared to be 3 innocent infants. Dr. Hayes felt his medical oath warring with the necessity of their situation. "There has to be another way," he insisted. "They may be alien entities, but those bodies were born from human parents." "Surely, Doctor," Dr. Thornton interrupted gently, "I understand your reluctance. I've faced this same choice in other communities. But you have to understand, those aren't really children in any meaningful sense. They're constructs, artificial vessels created to house consciousnesses that are millions of years old. The mercy you show them will damn every human being on this continent." As they debated, the situation inside the building was reaching a critical point. Through the swirling vortex of the entrance, They could see Clara and Thomas Whitmore standing motionless beside their 3 children, who had grown visibly since their birth, not in the natural way of human infants, but stretching and elongating like beings adapting to their true form. The triplets' translucent skin now pulsed with veins of light that connected them to massive geometric patterns carved into the air itself. Beyond these patterns, glimpses of the entity's home dimension were becoming visible, vast cities that defied architectural logic, populated by beings of living shadow and starlight, all turning their attention toward the small tear in reality that had opened in a frontier town in Missouri. "We're out of time," Dr. Thornton announced, his instruments registering massive dimensional fluctuations. "The gateway is almost stable enough for mass transit. We have to act now." The assault team entered the transformed building through the vortex entrance, immediately finding themselves in a space that existed only partially in their reality. Gravity worked differently here, pulling in multiple directions at once. Sound carried in ways that suggested vast distances despite the apparent confines of the structure, and everywhere the air hummed with energies that made their skin crawl, and their minds struggled to process what they were experiencing. At the center of it all stood the Whitmore family, but they had undergone transformations that revealed their true nature. Clara was no longer even remotely human in appearance. Her form had elongated into something resembling a living constellation, points of light connected by streams of energy. Thomas had become translucent to the point of near invisibility, a ghostly figure caught between human and alien existence. But it was the triplets that commanded attention. No longer infant-sized, they had grown to the size of children while retaining their boneless fluid nature. They moved in perfect synchronization, their forms rippling and flowing as they maintained the complex geometric patterns that served as focal points for the dimensional gateway. "You arrived just in time to witness the return," they spoke in unison, their voices now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the alien dimension beyond the gateway. "Our people have waited millennia for this moment. Soon this reality will be remade in the image of our perfection." Thornton raised a weapon that combined the principles of both science and faith, a rifle modified with blessed silver bullets and inscribed with protective symbols from a dozen different spiritual traditions. "We've stopped your kind before," he called to the entities, "and we'll stop you again." The triplets' laugh was like the sound of crystal breaking in harmony. "You delay the inevitable, Watcher. We are patient. We are eternal. If not here, then elsewhere. If not now, then in another generation. Humanity's time is ending, and ours is beginning anew." As Dr. Thornton took aim, the entities began to move within human speed, their fluid forms making them difficult targets. But they had made a crucial error in their arrogance. They had remained connected to the local children they had partially transformed, drawing power from the bonds they had created. Father Santos and his team had completed their work outside, successfully freeing all of the affected children from alien influence. As each child was returned to their human state, the power available to the primary entities decreased proportionally. The geometric patterns that maintained the dimensional gateway began to flicker and destabilize. "Now," Dr. Thornton shouted, and the assault team opened fire with their sanctified weapons, the blessed silver bullets, enhanced with spiritual energies from multiple faith traditions, tore through the entity's forms like acids through water. Where they struck, the triplets' translucent flesh dissolved, revealing the alien consciousness beneath, struggling to maintain cohesion in a reality that was fundamentally hostile to their existence. But the entities were not defenseless. As their forms began to dissolve, they lashed out with energies that warped space and time around them. Professor Blackwood was caught by one such attack, his body aging decades in seconds before Dr. Thornton could pull him to safety. Another Watcher simply vanished, erased from existence by forces that operated outside the normal laws of physics. The battle reached its climax as the dimensional gateway began to collapse, its alien geometries folding in on themselves as the anchor points provided by the triplets failed. Through the closing portal, Dr. Hayes could see the vast alien civilization beyond, billions of entities pressing forward in a desperate attempt to cross over before the opportunity was lost. Clara, her constellation form flickering between dimensions, made one final attempt to preserve the gateway. "You cannot stop what has already begun," she cried as her essence began to disperse. "We have planted seeds in dozens of communities across your continent. This defeat is merely a delay." With a sound like reality itself tearing, the dimensional gateway collapsed completely, taking with it the transformed general store and everything within its impossible architecture. Where the building had stood, only a perfectly circular patch of bare earth remained, so cold that frost continued to form on its surface, despite the arrival of spring weather. The Whitmore family had vanished entirely, either destroyed in the dimensional collapse, or pulled back into their alien realm. The immediate threat to St. Genevieve was over, but Dr. Thornton's expression remained grim as he surveyed the aftermath. This was just one incursion, he told Dr. Hayes as they helped the freed children reunite with their families. Clara was right. They've been establishing footholds across the frontier territories. We've stopped them here, but there will be other communities, other attempts. Hayes looked around at his town, at the families embracing children who had been returned to their human nature, at the ordinary buildings and streets that had briefly been transformed into something from an alien nightmare. How do we prevent this from happening again? We watch. Thornton replied. We study, we prepare, and when they try again, we'll be ready. He handed Dr. Hayes a small silver pendant, inscribed with symbols from multiple spiritual traditions. This will help you recognize their influence if you encounter it again, and if you do, send word to the network. You're one of us now, Dr. Hayes, a watcher, dedicated to protecting humanity from forces that would remake us in their image. As the aurora borealis faded from the sky and normal weather patterns returned to Missouri, Dr. Hayes realized that his life had been fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a frontier physician, but a guardian against threats that most people couldn't even imagine. The responsibility was daunting, but as he watched Billy Morrison play with his wooden toy horse once again, a normal human child, he knew that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. The mystery of the three brothers born without bones or blood had been solved, but it had revealed a larger mystery that would require constant vigilance to address. Somewhere out there, in the growing settlements and isolated communities of the expanding frontier, other families might arrive with impossible children, other communities might face the choice between transformation and resistance, and when they did, the Watchers would be ready. The official records of St. Genevieve make no mention of the events of February and March 18. The town's population remained stable, no unusual deaths were recorded, and life continued with the ordinary rhythm of frontier existence. But those who lived through those terrifying weeks carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives, and their descendants preserved the stories in carefully guarded family traditions. Dr. Hayes continued to practice medicine in St. Genevieve for another 30 years, but he also served as the region's primary watcher, monitoring for signs of supernatural incursions and maintaining contact with the network of guardians that Dr. Thornton had revealed. His detailed journals, hidden in a secret compartment in his cabin, provided crucial intelligence for future operations against the entities that still sought to reclaim Earth. Professor Blackwood, despite the aging he had suffered during the final battle, survived to publish several papers on anomalous anthropological phenomena that helped establish scientific frameworks for understanding supernatural threats. His work became required reading within the Watcher network, though it was dismissed by mainstream academia as interesting fiction. The children who had been temporarily transformed showed no lasting effects from their ordeal, though several displayed unusual intuitive abilities in later life. Billy Morrison became a successful businessman who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict market trends and weather patterns. Others showed similar gifts, as if their brief connection to alien consciousness had left them with enhanced perception of the world around them. Thomas and Clara Whitmore were never seen again, their fate remaining a mystery that troubled Dr. Hayes for years. Had they been destroyed in the dimensional collapse, or had they retreated to their alien realm to plan new incursions? The question would remain unanswered, but reports from other watchers suggested that similar couples had been observed in settlements across the frontier territories. In 1847, 15 years after the events in St. Genevieve, Dr. Hayes received a letter that chilled him to the bone. It was from a physician in Oregon Territory, describing the birth of triplets who possessed no skeletal structure and showed signs of intelligence far beyond normal human infants. The pattern was repeating itself just as Clara had predicted. Hayes gathered his watcher equipment and prepared for another journey, another battle against forces that threatened the very essence of human existence. As he rode west toward Oregon, he reflected on the nature of the conflict he had become part of. This wasn't a war that could be won with a single victory, or lost with a single defeat. It was an ongoing struggle between two forms of existence that could not coexist. The entities that had briefly claimed St. Genevieve represented a form of consciousness that was ancient beyond human comprehension, patient beyond human understanding, and driven by a certainty that their way of existence was superior to humanity's chaotic, emotional, individual-focused civilization. They would continue their attempts to reshape Earth's population, using humanity's own protective instincts and family bonds as weapons against them. But humanity had advantages as well. The diversity of spiritual traditions that the Watchers drew upon, the scientific curiosity that drove researchers like Professor Blackwood, the simple courage of ordinary people like Sheriff Hollister and Reverend Stone, who refused to surrender their humanity, even in the face of impossible threats. As Dr. Hayes disappeared into the vast expanse of the American frontier, carrying with him the knowledge and tools necessary to fight another battle in a war that might last for generations, he represented something that the ancient entities had not anticipated when they began their campaign of gradual conquest. He represented hope. The three brothers born without bones or blood had been defeated. Their impossible existence ended before they could complete their mission. But they had also served as a warning, a demonstration of the threats that lurked in the spaces between realities, waiting for the right moment to emerge and claim what they considered their birthright. The frontier territories of 1832 America were vast and largely unguarded, perfect hunting grounds for entities that preferred to work in isolation and secrecy. But they were also populated by people who possessed a stubborn independence and fierce protective instinct that made them formidable opponents when properly motivated and equipped. The mystery of the Whitmore triplets had been solved, but the larger mystery of humanity's place in a universe filled with ancient, hostile intelligences had only begun to unfold. And somewhere in the growing darkness of the American frontier, other families with impossible children were settling into other communities, beginning other cycles of gradual transformation that would test the limits of human courage and determination. The watch continues, the battle goes on, and the price of freedom, as always, is eternal vigilance against those who would steal not just our lives, but our very humanity itself. In the end, the tale of the three brothers born without bones or blood stands as a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some knowledge too dangerous to pursue, and some threats too alien to fully comprehend. But it also stands as a testament to the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil, to choose courage over comfort, and to fight for their humanity, even when the odds seem impossible. The frontier has been tamed, the territories have become states, and the isolated communities of 1832 have grown into modern cities. But the ancient entities that once sought to reclaim Earth through gradual infiltration have not forgotten their defeat, and somewhere in the vast cosmos, they wait with the patience of geological time for another opportunity to return. When that time comes, humanity's survival will once again depend on the courage of individuals, willing to stand against forces beyond comprehension, armed with nothing but their determination to remain human in the face of promises of transcendence. The mystery continues, the watch endures, and the price of our humanity remains constant vigilance against those who would remake us in their image. This has been the story of the three brothers born without bones or blood, and the brave souls who refused to let their impossible existence reshape the world in ways too terrible to imagine.